In the 1500s, London was a city where your head could end up on a spike on London Bridge simply for being on the wrong side of the king. It was a place of executions, plagues, and religious terror, yet 500,000 people called it home. This is Tudor London, where power was absolute and life was cheap. In this video, I use modern AI tools to bring historic paintings and engravings to life, allowing us to shift perspective, change camera angles, and move through these scenes in ways their original artists never could. But first, I have to say this. While researching this video, I truly grasped just how ruthless Tudor London really was. Walking through London's crowded streets today, it's almost impossible to imagine the dark history lying beneath your feet. Rising above London's skyline, the Tower of London in the 1500s stood as the ultimate symbol of royal power and terror. From the outside, it looked like a magnificent castle. But behind these walls, some of the darkest pages of English history were written. During Henry VIII's reign, the Tower was no ordinary prison. This was the place where the king's enemies, real or imagined, drew their final breaths. In 1536, the king's second wife, Anne Boleyn, knelt in this very courtyard. Her crime? Failing to give Henry a male heir and being accused of adultery. In truth, her only crime was exhausting a king's patience. Anne Boleyn's execution was no ordinary beheading. Henry specially commissioned a swordsman from France. Unlike the axe, the sword was considered faster and more humane, though I suppose that's small comfort when someone's about to take your head. The tower's walls consumed not just queens, but cardinals, lords, and common people alike. Thomas More, author of Utopia and the king's former chief advisor, was imprisoned here for refusing to accept Henry as the head of the Church of England. He too lost his head. Here's the interesting part. The tower wasn't just a prison. It was also home to the royal treasury, the armory, and even a royal menagerie. Lions, leopards, and even a polar bear lived within these walls. Visitors could pay to see the wild animals, if they were brave enough. Today, the Tower of London still stands and remains one of London's most visited tourist attractions. But as you walk between those stone walls, you can't help but think of those who stepped on the same stones centuries ago and never made it out. Stretching across the River Thames, Old London Bridge in the 1500s was London's most remarkable structure, though perhaps not for the reasons you might think. The bridge was far more than a simple river crossing. Houses, shops, churches, and even a chapel lined its length. From a distance, it looked less like a bridge and more like an entire neighborhood floating above the water. People were born here, lived here, and died here, quite literally. But the bridge's most famous feature was the view at its southern gatehouse, human heads mounted on spikes. Those executed for treason had their heads boiled in tar, both for preservation and to reduce the smell, then placed on spikes at the bridge's southern gate. These heads would remain there for weeks, sometimes months. When space was needed for newcomers, the oldest heads were simply tossed into the river. In 1535, Thomas More's head was displayed on one of these spikes. His daughter, Margaret, bribed the guards to retrieve it and, according to legend, kept it with her until she died. Passing beneath the bridge was equally dangerous. The water current rushing through the narrow arches was so powerful that small boats could easily capsize. Londoners called this shooting the bridge. Inexperienced captains frequently lost their lives. During winter months, the restricted flow beneath the narrow arches contributed to the river freezing. During these rare periods, frost fairs were held on the Thames. People would walk on the frozen river, play games, and buy food. The normally deadly river briefly transformed into a festival ground. Remarkably, this bridge survived until 1831. Today, the modern London Bridge stands in its place, But some remnants of the original structure still lie beneath the Thames, silent witnesses to London's bloody past. Along the banks of the Thames, to the west of London, Westminster was where all political and religious power converged. The building we know today as the Houses of Parliament was, in the 1500s, Westminster Palace, the primary residence of kings. Westminster Abbey represented the spiritual dimension of this power. For centuries, kings and queens were crowned here, married here, and buried here. From Henry VIII's mother Elizabeth of York to Henry himself, the traces of the Tudor dynasty are carved into these stones. But during Henry VIII's reign, Westminster witnessed one of the most radical transformations in English history, the Reformation. In 1534, Henry rejected the Pope's authority and declared himself the head of the Church of England. His reasons weren't theological. He wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn, and the Pope wouldn't allow it. A king's romantic obsession turned an entire nation's religious structure upside down. When the dissolution of the monasteries began, even Westminster Abbey was at risk. Henry's men closed monasteries across the country, seized their wealth, and threw monks onto the streets. Centuries-old religious institutions were destroyed within months. Westminster Hall was the oldest and most impressive part of the palace. Its massive wooden roof was one of the engineering marvels of the age. Courts were held here, state trials conducted, and kings hosted feasts. Centuries later, the death sentence of Charles I would be pronounced in this very hall. Today, Westminster remains the heart of British democracy and monarchy. The Parliament buildings, the Abbey, and the remnants of the old palace stand as living proof of how deeply power has taken root in this land. Rising along the Thames to the west of London, Hampton Court Palace was the most magnificent palace of the Tudor era. But here's the interesting thing. Henry VIII didn't build it. The palace was actually the work of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Henry's chief advisor and England's most powerful churchman, Wolsey, built this palace as his own residence. It was so magnificent that the king felt his own palaces were inadequate. When Wolsey fell from favor in 1529, for failing to secure Henry's divorce, he was forced to gift the palace to the king. Of course, this gift wasn't enough to save his life. Wolsey died on the road while being brought to London to face treason charges. Henry expanded Hampton Court and made it even more splendid. The Great Hall was one of the most impressive interiors of the age. Its walls covered with precious tapestries, its ceiling adorned with gold leaf. In this hall, the king entertained guests and displayed his power. The palace kitchens were an engineering marvel in themselves. Hundreds of cooks and servants worked to feed thousands of people daily. Wine cellars, bakeries, butcher shops, the palace was like a small city unto itself. One of Hampton Court's most famous features is its maze. Still visitable today, this maze was originally built as entertainment in the palace gardens. According to legend, Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, ran through the palace corridors trying to plead with the king before being arrested on charges of adultery. The guards caught her and she never saw Henry's face again. To this day, it's said that Catherine's ghost wanders the section of the palace known as the Haunted Gallery. Hampton Court Palace is now a museum open to the public. As one of the best preserved structures of the Tudor era, it attracts hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. Towering above London's skyline, rising above all other structures, stood a giant. Old St. Paul's Cathedral. Not the domed building we see today. That was built after the Great Fire of 1666. Tudor London's St. Paul's was something entirely different. Built in the Gothic style, this cathedral boasted the tallest church spire of its time and was one of the largest cathedrals in Europe. The spire was so tall that lightning strikes frequently caused damage. A lightning strike in 1561 completely destroyed the spire and it never regained its original height. But St. Paul's wasn't just a place of worship. The cathedral's main nave, known as Paul's Walk, was a meeting place and commercial center. Lawyers sought clients, merchants made deals, the unemployed wandered hoping to find work. What should have been a sacred space had become one of London's busiest marketplaces. During Henry VIII's reforms, the cathedral's treasures were seized. Gold and silver items were melted down, valuable objects sold. The chapels and altars inside the cathedral were plundered. Centuries of religious heritage was ransacked within a few years. The cathedral courtyard was also a place of public executions. Sermons, religious debates, and the reading of death sentences all took place here. In the same spot, people both prayed and had their death sentences announced. The Great Fire of 1666 completely destroyed Old St. Paul's. Today, Christopher Wren's iconic domed structure rises in its place. But the foundations of the original cathedral still lie beneath the modern building. Now let's leave the palaces and cathedrals behind and descend into the streets where ordinary Londoners lived. Tudor London wasn't the picturesque place of romantic paintings. With its smells, noise, and dangers, it was a place where you had to earn your survival anew each day. The streets were narrow, and wooden houses stood so close together that the upper floors of facing buildings nearly touched. Sunlight barely reached the lower floors. This explains why fires were so devastating. When one house caught fire, flames would engulf the entire street within seconds. There was no sewage system. People emptied their chamber pots out the window onto the street. They would shout, "Gare de l'eau," from the French gare à l'eau, meaning watch out for water, to warn those below. Walking the streets, you had to dodge not only thieves, but surprises from above. Plague was a constant reality in Tudor London. Multiple outbreaks ravaged the city during the 1500s. While the wealthy fled to the countryside, the poor stayed in the city and awaited death. Plague houses were marked with red crosses and their doors were sealed from outside for 40 days, regardless of whether those inside were actually sick. Markets and bazaars were the center of daily life. Cheapside was one of London's most important commercial streets. Goldsmiths, drapers, spice merchants, each trade clustered in its own street. This tradition lives on in some London street names today: Bread Street, Milk Street, Poultry. Entertainment was never in short supply. Bear baiting, cockfighting, and theater performances were the public's favorite activities. The Southwark district was known as London's Sin City. Brothels, gambling houses, and taverns concentrated here. Though officially illegal, authorities mostly turned a blind eye. The apprenticeship system was virtually the only path to social mobility for young people. At age 7 or 8, a child would be given to a master and work unpaid for 7 years while learning a trade. Those who succeeded could open their own shops and even become wealthy merchants. Walking through these streets, a different world awaited you at every corner. One step away, a lord's ostentatious mansion. The next step, families living in squalor. Tudor London was a place where inequality was displayed in its most naked form. Speaking of Tudor London without mentioning Henry VIII is impossible. This king, with his 6 wives, his break with the church, and his ruthless rule forever changed not only England but London's physical and spiritual fabric. When Henry ascended to the throne in 1509, he was seen as a handsome, athletic, and cultured prince. He composed music, wrote poetry, competed in tournaments. He was Europe's most promising young king. But as the years passed, this young prince transformed into one of history's most feared rulers. 6 marriages, 2 executions, 2 divorces, 1 death, and 1 survivor, summarized in the tragic cycle: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Henry's London was a reflection of his personality. On one hand, magnificent palaces like Hampton Court and Greenwich. On the other, terror-inspiring fortresses like the Tower. On one side, dance and music. On the other, execution scaffolds. The dissolution of the monasteries radically changed London's physical appearance. Religious buildings that had been woven into the city's fabric for centuries were demolished, seized, or converted to other purposes. Some were sold to wealthy lords and turned into private mansions. Henry's death came in 1547. The England he left behind was completely different from the country he had inherited. A Catholic kingdom had transformed into a Protestant power, and London was both witness and victim to this transformation. Now I want to bring you to present-day London and show you what remains from the Tudor era, because that dark, bloody past hasn't completely vanished. If you look carefully, you can still see its traces. The Tower of London still rises along the Thames just as it did 5 centuries ago. Heads are no longer severed, but the crown jewels are still kept here. Every evening, the yeoman warders perform the ceremony of locking the gates, just as they have for 700 years. London Bridge, of course, is no longer the same bridge. No houses on top, no severed heads. A modern concrete structure has taken its place. But at the bridge's southern end, you can find a commemorative plaque marking the site of the original structure. Westminster Abbey has hosted countless coronation ceremonies since Tudor times. Henry VIII's mother's tomb is still here, and every year millions of tourists walk on the same stones where kings walked centuries ago. Hampton Court Palace is perhaps the best preserved site of Tudor heritage. The Great Hall, the kitchens, the maze, they stand almost exactly as they appeared 5 centuries ago. I can't guarantee you'll see Catherine Howard's ghost, but it's worth trying. Walking these streets, looking at these buildings, you can't help but feel how close the past really is. 5 centuries ago, people were born, lived, fell in love, and died in these very places. Some were crowned, some lost their heads, some made history, some were forgotten. Tudor London was ruthless, dangerous, and beautiful, all at the same time. And through these AI reconstructions, we get the chance to experience that world, even if just for a moment. If there's another city, another era you'd like to see, let me know in the comments. I'd love to continue this journey into the past with you. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.